Hello and welcome back to Games and Thoughts. I'll be your host for today, Traxton. And today we'll be talking about a blog post that I wrote a while ago but never got around to recording, called A Bug's Life. Corny name, I know. And it's about lower level consciousnesses and our unwarranted apathy toward them. So basically, I'll start this off with a little anecdote. On my most recent camping trip, I was sitting on my ground mat outside of my tent and staring off into the trees and, just trying to take in the silence and all that good stuff. And I was repeatedly interrupted by an unrelenting stream of insects falling onto my mat. Spiders, ants, flies, they all paid no mind to my efforts to enjoy the silence. And as a result, I started to get agitated at the many tiny life forms gathering around my feet. But it was actually at this realization that these were a collection of sentient beings trying to share my mat with me that I noticed a profound shift in perspective toward the scenario. On an intellectual level, I think everyone understands this, right? Few people would question that insects are conscious beings, although how conscious they are is an interesting line of inquiry. It's beside the point for now. But it's not very often that our experience of noticing an insect is the same as if we were run into, say, a horse. It just doesn't feel as if we're in the presence of a life form. And resulting from this, we tend not even to bat an eye when we see someone squashing a spider or swatting a fly, even when the motive for doing so usually boils down to some version of "it was in my way." But imagine for a moment that one were to apply this behavior to larger, more aesthetically pleasing animals. It's easy to assume that anyone who went out of their way to squash or beat to death wild rabbits or kittens simply for perceiving them to be in one's way would face, at the very least, a harsh amount of social shaming. Our empathy for the kittens, and our recognition of them as a sentient being with the capacity to suffer or not suffer, would immediately produce a visceral emotive response toward the perpetrator of such violence. And yet, we routinely don't have such a response toward those who apathetically kill insects. So why is this the case? The answer is at least partly evolutionary. Historically speaking, insects were a sometimes deadly nuisance to ancestors, so it would make sense that the past lives of humans would produce no biological urge toward caring about insects. Cats, dogs, and other mammals, on the other hand, have been domesticated and helpful to use for thousands of years, and as such, our brains are hardwired to experience empathetic responses toward them. Secondly, we imagine the life of an insect to be less experientially complex than that of mammals or other large animals. We think of them as machines of reproduction, conscious only enough to pass their genes on to the next generation. However, the first part of that explanation is irrelevant to how we ought to see the situation now, and the latter is misguided. There are plenty of evolutionary footprints on the human genome that are worth outgrowing. Our affinity for greed and tribalism can certainly be attributed to natural selection, but they are no longer necessary to retain. That is to say that explaining a phenomenon in Darwinian terms is not sufficient for arguing for its current necessity. Further, our attribution of mechanical simplicity to insects as excuse for our apathy toward them is merely a result of lack of observation. Take bees, for example, an insect which is capable of seeing ultraviolet light in order to pinpoint the location of nectar within plants. Certain kinds of bees also have a type of movement communication. They dance around in specific ways to communicate to other bees. Both of these are undoubtedly high-level functions in comparison to bacteria and other relatively low-level organisms. And as an aside, I'd say that it's also quite complex compared to human infants. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any infant behavior quite as complex as that we just described with bees. But back to the text. If we were to examine other insects, we would find a spectrum of intelligences and abilities resulting in a vast array of potential conscious experiences. And with this in mind, we can conclude that the contents of a given insect's consciousness matter to the insect in question. That is to say that the life of a particular insect can be better or worse than another one, or can be filled with more or less suffering or ease. One would rather be a spider that is never hungry and produces plenty of eggs than one who is an unsuccessful hunter and is captured by a 5-year-old human boy, only to have its legs ripped off as an experiment. This is not to equate insect life with human life, of course. It is merely to acknowledge that insect life is located somewhere on the continuum of possible experiences in the universe, rather than being in the same category as inorganic matter. And from this reasoning, it's fairly easy to conclude that we should, at the very least, not feel as if killing insects is inconsequential, in the way that tossing a pebble is. Rather, any action toward an insect is truly an act toward another living thing, and we should regard it as such. The extent to which we are capable of producing suffering or well-being in these lower-level beings is unknown, and it's almost certainly not very large. The Holocaust undoubtedly produced a larger amount of pain than moth traps do, and to begin a social campaign over insect abuse is probably a waste of one's time. However, to evaluate our action towards bugs as completely unworthy of our time is also, I think, to miss the boat. So, to finish this up by concluding with my anecdote, as I considered this, I had the experience of no longer being bothered by the insects surrounding me. They were merely creatures living their lives, not an unfortunate part of nature designed to annoy me. It appears to me that this is another reason to evaluate the situation as described in this essay. Purely pragmatically, our experience of the world will be better if we hold less hostility and more care for our co-inhabitants of the environment. Nature is incredibly diverse in its productions, and each sentient being is indeed the center of the universe, in the sense that one can only experience life through the lens of its own consciousness. In my view, we ought to act in alignment with that reality, rather than seeing some beings as inconsequential in their existence. So that wraps up this blog post. Be sure to follow Games and Thoughts wherever you can, and we will continue the conversation with you guys next time.